Well, hello, everybody. Welcome once again to ICMDA webinars hosted by the International Christian Medical and Dental Association. I'm Dr. Mark Pickering. I'm the Chief Executive of the Christian Medical Fellowship, CMF, in the UK and Ireland. We're one of 107 national member movements within ICMDA, which brings together over 60,000 Christian dentists and doctors worldwide. And today, for webinar 243, I'm delighted to be introducing my good friend and colleague from CMF, Dr. Felicia Wong, who's both a GP or family practitioner in London and CMF's head of conferences and equipping. Felicia will be speaking on justice in healthcare, reflecting God's heart for the vulnerable. As Christians, we're called to reflect God's heart for justice, particularly for the vulnerable and marginalized. All around us are opportunities to address injustices and inequalities in healthcare using the skills and resources God has given us. And so today we'll explore the biblical foundation of justice and we'll distinguish it from the world's idea of justice. We'll discuss how Christian healthcare professionals can address inequality with a mindset grounded in Scripture. And we'll also look at how to embrace God's call for justice. Felicia will speak for about 30 minutes and then we'll have a time of questions and answers. So, Felicia, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you for that warm welcome, Mark. And today, as Mark has said, we're talking about justice in healthcare, and it's great to see you all from all around the world. So thank you for joining us today. Well, justice is an issue that provokes division and strong opinion. What do we mean by justice? Does justice matter for the Christian? And if so, why? How can we be sure that we're not just jumping onto the secular social justice bandwagon? When you come across injustice, do you feel weak, helpless, and overwhelmed as you look around at the injustices and inequalities of your healthcare system, of your country? Do you wonder how you can make a difference as a Christian healthcare worker? Well, we can't possibly cover this vast topic in detail in the next hour, but this is an opportunity to begin to think about justice in healthcare and to seek the Lord's face together. Many of you will already have thought hard about this subject, so of course, please bear with me as we take a bit of a whistle-stop tour. There is a bit of a UK focus to some of my talk, but given that this is a unique opportunity of bringing brothers and sisters together from so many continents, we will no doubt touch on the global aspects of healthcare justice in the Q&A afterwards. But during the talk, please do think about how this would apply in your own country and your own local context. Well, throughout the Bible, justice is prominent as part of God's character. I mean, you won't have failed to notice throughout the whole Bible, Old and New Testaments, that God constantly talks about justice. Well, what does God say about justice? This slide has just got a few quotes that I've put on there, scripture verses, but there are many more. And I'm just going to read some of them. Proverbs 31, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy. And that's from Proverbs 31. Micah 6 says, this is what the Lord Almighty said, administer true justice, show mercy and compassion to one another. And Proverbs 14, whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God. I don't know about you, but that really cuts to the heart. Justice in the Bible means to treat people justly, fairly, and give people their rights. Well, throughout the Old Testament, justice refers to the care and cause of the quartet of the vulnerable, which you'll see on this slide, those who had no social power, widows, orphans, immigrants, the poor. And we can expand this quartet to include many other groups in our society today. Think about who these are in your context. According to the Bible, the justness or fairness of a society is judged by how it treats these groups. Any neglect is not merely a lack of mercy or charity, but God calls it a violation of justice. God loves and defends those with the least economic and social power, and so should we. Doing justice is therefore about care for the poor, the weak, and the vulnerable. God's word is the very basis for justice and the solution to injustice. Justice is rooted in the very character of God and is the outworking of that character. And it's based on human beings being made in the image of God, which gives us a relational rather than inherent dignity. So sometimes you'll hear people talking about human rights. Well, we only have human rights because we're made in the image of God, not just for our own sake. So we should be concerned about the weak and the vulnerable in our society because God is concerned about them. God is known as their defender, identifying with the powerless and taking up their cause. And this is one of the ways we know and honor God, by defending the poor and needy. Have you ever thought of it in that way? This is one of the ways we honor God. It's about being righteous, living righteously with God and others, and conducting ourselves with fairness, generosity, and equity. So justice isn't just some abstract concept, but first and foremost, justice reflects who God is, his heart towards people, particularly the vulnerable, oppressed, and voiceless, and it's rooted in the very character of God. So let's not forget, justice is rooted in the very character of God. To do justice, therefore, is not an option as a Christian, but it's a reflection of who God is and his heart for the vulnerable, showing the world who our God is. Now, we can't ignore the fact that all around us in our world today, we hear calls and cries for justice. Justice is a big topic out there in the world, but it can be easy to mistake the world's concept of justice or social justice to mean the same thing as justice in the Bible or biblical justice. Often, different people define and apply justice differently. Now, of course, what's wonderful in some ways is that our culture is passionate about fighting for a cause. But it does seem like society is becoming more and more divided, and people are becoming more and more zealous about the causes they stand for, whether good, bad, or ugly. How do we navigate through this as Christians? Many causes seem just and compelling, but are there anti-God ideologies and agendas behind some of them? So we're going to spend some time now looking at the main differences between biblical and non-biblical justice. Non-biblical justice theories all assume that there are no transcendent moral absolutes on which to base justice. So there isn't an absolute right or wrong. Nobody can say what that is. That's what non-biblical justice is about. And instead, the moral values and the definition of justice are invented by human beings. Human nature is a blank slate that can be reshaped by human means. And that's compared with biblical justice, which is based on a God-given nature that must be honored for us to thrive. Here are the main categories of non-biblical justice. Libertarian, which is primarily about freedom. So justice is basically about freedom. Liberal means it's about justice is about fairness in our society. The utilitarian model is justice is about happiness. It's the pursuit of happiness above everything else. And then a postmodern model justice is about power. Who has the power and who should have the power? So bear these in mind. There's freedom, there's happiness, and power. And of course, these are good things in themselves. Although these theories raise rightful concerns, though, and some of it obviously stems from Christian backgrounds, we as Christians should not wholly align ourselves with just any of them. And I'm going to show you why. So only biblical justice, so in other words, the justice that we find in the Bible, is thorough and comprehensive enough to address the needs of the human condition, of the human heart, because it's based on God's character. And of course, God's character is the moral absolute. There is no other standard by which humanity or anything else should be compared but God's character. God is the one who will ultimately bring true justice. Christianity is not utopian. In other words, we can fight for justice in the knowledge that eventually God will put all things right. But until then, we as humans can never expect to fully fix the world. And that's different from the way justice, the worldly justice is. And only biblical justice addresses all the concerns of justice across these views. So biblical justice actually tackles freedom, fairness, happiness, and power. And of course, it's eternal. Biblical justice is eternal, not temporal, not just for this life. And it doesn't just challenge power, it redefines what power is. Where the worldly view of social justice focuses on a temporal view of addressing injustices in the society here and now, basically. So in other words, social justice talks about how do we address injustice in the here and now. Biblical justice starts with the eternal in mind and sees people as God sees them in their entirety. It's rooted in God's character and it's rooted in the gospel. How the loving, sovereign God rescues, reconciles, and restores broken sinners to himself in a fallen world by giving us his only Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. That's the only true story that addresses all of this. Now, some of you may have come across this concept, but no talk on justice in this current age would be complete without some reference to critical theory. Critical theory is very prevalent in many of our societies today. You may be someone who knows a lot about critical theory, or this may be new to you. But here's a quick sort of summary of what that's about, because you'll recognize it in its various forms. Critical theory is the ideology behind woke activism and cancel culture. So the idea about, well, what's the right thing that we should be doing in society? And actually, if it's not what we should be talking about, you're cancelled. We don't want to hear your voice. And it's a worldview that seeks to divide society into the privileged and the oppressed. It builds on the assumption that there is no transcendent God, and so we each construct our own reality. And this, of course, leads to a blurring of distinctions between truth and lies, ending up with a false gospel. So, what are the distortions? What are the wrong things about critical theory? There is no creator God. And so, therefore, there's no standard of God. There's no reference to God. And with no reference to God, there is no absolute morality. Who decides what's right and wrong? Who decides what's good or bad? And so there's no ultimate truth. What is truth anyway? Without God, there is no ultimate truth. And what are the 5 pillars of critical theory? So what are the main things that you need to know about critical theory? Well, that truth claims are power grabs. So what I mean by that is that if someone or a party or a group, or even Christians, for instance, claim that something is true, then that's just a means of wanting to grab that power and say, well, we're the ones. It's a means of control, is what critical theory is saying. That universal explanations are suspect. So the things that we've learned throughout history about science and all the things that we've learned growing up, as it were, particularly science and maths and all those kind of things, are now suspicious, suspect. How can we know they're true? Maybe it was just a way for someone to have power. So reason, logic, and science have become are tools of oppression. So if you use reason, logic, or science, you're just using it to oppress another group. And of course, you will be familiar with this. Don't question my experience. If I say it's true because I think it's true, then who are you to say otherwise? If I believe that you're oppressing me, then it's my truth, and you can't tell me otherwise. And all authority structures are repressive. So that's why the church and Christianity is particularly under fire, because, of course, it's seen as an authority structure. And as Christians, we are to be confident that as we proclaim the glory of God's, that we can proclaim the glory of God's truth. The fact that we are created in God's image is the only firm foundation for human dignity. Now, Christianity and critical theory are competing worldviews. So let's be wise and alert about not being led astray or held captive by non-biblical models. So if you look at Christianity, you know the gospel story of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration, which explains the whole of humanity and God's big plan. Whereas critical theory is saying, well, actually, the reason why this world is broken is because of oppression. And of course, it's not to say that there isn't any truth in some of the oppression and things that have been horribly wrong before in history. So I'm not denying that. It's just that that's not the whole story. And, that's not the outworking of what justice looks like. And therefore, they're saying that the only way that you could redeem or solve it is by activism and protest, and liberate the oppressed groups is the only way for restoration. So you can see that they're quite different there. They're competing worldviews. So like I said, let's not be held captive by non-biblical models which don't understand humanity and have no reference to good, sovereign creator God who is working out his plans and purposes throughout history. Now, for those who may be worried that a focus on doing justice takes away from evangelism, in other words, proclaim the gospel, I want to pause here to be clear that humanity's greatest need is reconciliation to God, and therefore salvation from God's righteous judgment through Jesus Christ. So that's not taking away from it at all. I know there are churches, there are Christians who are nervous about social action or justice type things because they're saying, well, what about evangelism? But of course, the greatest challenge facing Christian social involvement or doing acts of justice or mercy is to keep in view the greatest gift we have to offer a needy world. And the greatest gift we have to offer is the gospel of Christ. So that must never be forgotten. That's central to everything. But doing justice, those acts of mercy, gives us as Christians a credible and compassionate foundation for sharing the gospel, which integrates word and deed in our lives. The ultimate fulfillment of God's blessings is in the future. And while Christians are called to be people of justice after God's own heart, we are to hold that right, healthy tension that we never expect to fully fix the world or achieve utopia here on earth. Humanity's eternal fate is more important than what happens to us in this life. So proclaiming the gospel must therefore be central to and at the heart of Christian social involvement. Social action can demonstrate the gospel, but without the gospel message, social action is like a signpost, pointing in the right direction and to nowhere. And some of you will be familiar with the Lausanne movement and the Micah network, which call for integral mission of gospel proclamation and social action together. Now, as Christians in healthcare, we see injustice around us every day. And yet, God has given us the heart, the skills, and the opportunities to address those injustices and inequalities. We have a role to play and can make a difference whoever we are and wherever God has placed us. Now, I know that here on this call, there'll be many different countries and your context will be different. And some of the injustices you face will be very different from what someone else faces in another country. But I want to encourage you and remind you that actually God has put you where you are at the moment. And no matter how junior you are, you will find that there are places where you can influence, you can say something, you can call out something. So never think that you have to wait till you get to the top. God is able to use us wherever we are, and we have the Holy Spirit within us. So we have a role to play. Well, if we look particularly at healthcare, who are the weak and the vulnerable in healthcare? I've got 3 slides here, which we're going to roughly go through quickly, but it's not comprehensive, as in you will have many more people to put onto there. Now, of course, in some senses, the weak and the vulnerable in healthcare is merely a subset of our society today. Although there are specific patient groups in this category, which I'll go through in a minute, all our patients are weak and vulnerable to a greater or lesser extent. because they are coming to us at a time of weakness, looking for us as doctors and dentists and healthcare professionals to help them. So in a way, they are in a lower position. So besides some of these particular patient groups, do see that everyone else is in a way the weak and vulnerable, and do look on that person as someone made in God's image, and take away the prejudices that you have and see them as how God sees them. So let's have a look. So for instance, if you look at the slide, there's the elderly, young people who are particularly in care, institutionalized adults, so people in institutions, whatever that might be, whether it's prisons or mental health institutions in your country, migrant workers, immigrants, patients who have suffered medical negligence, so as a result of medical or dental things having gone wrong. People are trafficked and enslaved, who have cognitive impairment or lack mental capacity, can't really make decisions properly, addictions, chronic illness, disability, language barriers, mental health, I mentioned, poor mobility, so people can't easily get somewhere. Other barriers, such as race, class, culture, geography, education, literacy, debt, unemployment. You'll be able to add many more. People with other communication difficulties, people who are offline and overlooked. So depending on how healthcare works in your country, certainly in the UK, there's a lot about how you have to book appointments on your phone or on the internet. And if you don't get into it immediately, and some people don't have phones, they don't have the internet, they're not easy, they can't work tech easily. And so it means that they're actually overlooked in that way. Prisoners and ex-offenders, refugees, single mothers. I talked about the elderly, the frail, the homeless, those who are housebound, the lonely, the poor, socially deprived, the unborn child. Let's not forget that the unborn child is the weak and vulnerable one and needs our protection. Victims of domestic abuse, victims of genocide, torture, ethnic cleansing, or some other prejudice, and you'll be able to name those in your country that leads to persecution. And then widows and widowers. So like I said, that's by no means comprehensive, but that's just a little bit to just show us who we're talking about. And as we've seen, doing justice reflects God's character, showing his glory to a weary and hopeless world around us. It's about our mindset, our heart attitude, and our motivation. How we view, care for, and interact with the person in front of us, or indeed anyone whom we come across, whether it's a colleague, the cleaner, the canteen staff, the porter, is an opportunity to be a person of justice. So even as you pause now, think, actually, am I looking at everyone in the way that God looks at them? Or am I either misusing my power or my position or my status and actually not particularly looking out for those who are particularly powerless? Well, what does it look like to do justice in healthcare? Let's talk about some of the practicalities. So again, this isn't going to be the end of it all, and I'm sure in the Q&A you can please do share some examples as well for everyone else to hear about. So services. So in other words, when you put on your services in the healthcare system, think about actually what times work for people, particularly those who you didn't think about, who maybe can't easily get up in the morning to come to a 9 o'clock appointment. So think about the times, the access, how easy is it for the vulnerable groups or the disadvantaged groups to be able to get to that clinic or that appointment. The speed of access. I mean, do they need to be coming a lot quicker rather than waiting a few months to a year? The denial of access. So sometimes we put criteria in for our clinics, for our healthcare systems that actually already have taken out a whole load of people that we haven't considered and thought, well, actually, where do they go then if we're not actually including them in our criteria? Do they have transport? Where is the location of your clinic? Is it so far away that actually there's no public transport to get there? So even just something as mundane, boring, and logistical as that really makes a difference to the patient and particularly to those groups that we don't necessarily think about. Appointment times and waiting lists, I've mentioned. the continuity of care. So depending on your context, is there pressure to discharge someone early when actually they're not ready to go home? Or if they go home, who's going to help them? They're on their own. What about the transition between primary and secondary care? Are they lost in the system? Are there notes so people can continue to care for them? And communication, between primary and secondary care, between the family doctor, the GP, and the hospital, or does the patient just show up and the hospital doesn't know what's happened or who this person is? But just follow up. It can be so easy for us to not think about how do we follow up for that patient, to not think about the patient journey, but just to think about our systems instead. But actually, so many times as a GP, I have people come to me and say, well, I was meant to receive an appointment, but I haven't heard anything, and it's months later. And what do I do about this dressing, or, about the pain I have, or the fact that I still can't walk or see? So when we're designing our systems, or if you're in a position where you can speak into that, please do think about the people whom we don't normally think about. Think about those vulnerable patient populations. And treatment. Now, I know this varies widely again across countries, but is this the right treatment for this patient at this time? Can they afford it? Can they actually get the medication? Am I just giving it to them because that's what's the right thing, or that's what everyone else does? But actually, it's not really right for this person. Because, again, I come across people who just prescribe the antihypertensives. They don't think about the person in front of them and think, actually, this side effect is more likely to affect this person, so I won't give that class of drug. So do we think about it in that way? Do we see that person as a whole? And then conflicts of interest, research, clinical trials, pharmaceutical companies. Is this, again, the right thing, the right treatment for this patient at this time? Or am I so keen to just get the patient in the trial, to get the numbers, that I'm not actually even seeing the patient in front of me? That matters to God. And policy. If you are, again, in a position of influence where you can speak up, where you can shape policy, then bear in mind those who cannot speak for themselves. So think about this in your own countries, your hospitals, your clinics, your healthcare systems. Today, we're only touching on this, and in this case, using some examples from the UK. But I want to acknowledge that there are many other injustices and examples where you live and work. Please do share them with us in the Q&A. And do write them down for yourself as God brings them to your mind and heart, even as I'm speaking. Start praying and thinking about how you can make a difference, no matter how small and no matter how junior you are. You can use your voice and you can use your influence. Whether you know it or not, as doctors, dentists, and healthcare professionals, we have a voice, we have influence, we have power more than we realize. Can you imagine the impact we can make if together, as God's people, we stand up and speak out for those who struggle to do so? If we advocate for those who cannot and we empower others to use their voice, how wonderful would that be, and how honoring to our Lord? What a powerful witness, and how different from the rest of the world. In healthcare, there are specific areas where we can address injustices and inequalities. And again, this is not an exhaustive list that we're coming to, but it starts us thinking about all the ways in which we can make that difference with a holistic and a Christ-centered mindset. And of course, we see the principles of justice depicted in the lives of people in the Bible. The Hebrew midwives in Exodus feared God and allowed the Hebrew boys to live against Pharaoh's command. They were prepared to face the consequences for doing what was right in the Lord's sight. The woman who had been bleeding for 12 years was a social and religious outcast with no status and no dignity. But despite the demands and stresses on him, Jesus, in his tenderness and compassion, saw her, healed her, and restored her. Well, what actions can we take to address injustice in healthcare? So prayer, absolutely, because that's our dependence on God to act and change the world through us. We can use our areas of influence, as I've mentioned, wherever God has placed us. We can advocate, we can stand up, we can speak out, we can write. And I know that's different in your different countries, but there will be things that you can do more than you realize. We can be involved in system and service changes. Some of you here will have a real heart for policy and management and that kind of thing. And that's important because we need Christian voices there to make these big system changes. What about other Christian partnerships and alliances, which you may have in your country, which also address injustice? Could you partner with them? Campaigning and activism, if you have the opportunity. Like I've mentioned, leadership roles, if you're in a position where you're going further up in your leadership role, that means you've got even more influence. Think about what you can do. And of course, just the wider Christian witness in the way we care for the weak and vulnerable. I tell you, that will speak volumes for other colleagues and patients to see that you are different in the way that you care for the patient in front of you. That is the fragrance of Christ working. Well, unfortunately, my time has come to an end. So I told you it was a whistle-stop tour. It's just touching on the surface, but hopefully gives you a lot to think about and to pray through about how you can act. But I wanted also to let you know about several great resources out there that have helped me think more deeply about justice as a Christian. And we will have these available for you as well. But there's several excellent books that I would recommend, which are there as well, but we will send them out. And also a lot of really excellent resources which are free on the website of Christian Institutes. So that's that one there. And also a lot of my material has come from excellent articles that Tim Keller has written, which are again available online. A biblical critique of secular justice and critical theory, justice in the Bible. So I definitely commend them to you for further reading. So thank you. Thank you for listening. And I'd love to hear your questions and your stories.
Great. Thank you very much, Felicia, for an excellent overview of God's heart for justice in healthcare. And do please be putting your questions into the Q&A section. We've got a couple coming in there, which we'll come to in a second. But I wanted to just start off with a personal question, Felicia, and to ask you what it was that first got you interested in this area, maybe one of the first issues that struck you as an important justice issue that you could address as a healthcare worker, or what maybe challenged you to realize that God's heart was for justice in these areas.
Thank you. That is a good question, isn't it? Actually, no one's ever asked me that. I think when I was growing up, I grew up in sort of Britain when it was particularly overtly racist, and so there was a lot of overt racism directed towards me. But you just get on with it. You just get on with life, and you just end up feeling a bit more invisible. And you just think, well, that's just what life is about. But then when I became a Christian, you realize actually there is someone who sees and notices, and that is the Lord God. And actually, as Christians, we can be different. And particularly as a GP in healthcare, you often see people who are so disadvantaged compared with us, you know, whether it's class or poverty or just the situations they've come from. When I've been in to see patients in their homes, and you just think, gosh, I didn't realize people live like this, or that they couldn't access the things that we take for granted. So, and also growing up, my mother used to always say, oh, you're just always championing the underdog, aren't you? So I think God has put it in me from the beginning.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. That's great to hear that. So coming on to one or two of the questions that are in the Q&A section already. So we've got a very good question here from David Bowen about critical theory. Thank you very much, Felicia, for helping us to see how that underpins so much of what we talk about in justice issues these days. And David said, isn't the core premise of critical theory that injustice becomes embedded in societal systems, so that creating justice also requires addressing system change, not only personal change? And would that not also be consistent with the Christian view of justice, that it's not only about individuals, but also about what individuals create?
Thank you. And I know that you and I discussed, Mark, that we would both sort of like, have a conversation about this. But thank you for that question. Absolutely. And although I touched on it very lightly, it was just to say that, of course, there are oppressive and wrong things within systems as well as individuals. And they are right to be addressed, whether it's racism or sexism or all those other things that critical theory does talk about. But of course, the way that critical theory comes at it is saying that those are the ultimate reasons why they don't call it sin, but why there's brokenness in humanity, and that the answer to it is therefore to oppress the groups that we think are the oppressors. So whilst there are good, right things that we want to pull out and not disregard, the whole sort of narrative about critical theory is, as I showed, very much contrary to the biblical view of where does brokenness come from and what is the solution.
Great,
Mark.
thank you. Yes, I think, and was it Dostoevsky that said that the dividing line between justice and injustice or right and wrong passes through the center of every human heart? I'm probably mashing that completely,
Something
but
like that, yeah.
it's that idea that, we're not dividing the world into the good people and the bad people, the oppressors and the oppressed. It's we are all a mixture of these things, and if we don't understand that, we will never really get to the heart of justice. So yes, we do have to change structures and address inequalities that are there within society. I've been reading a lot about William Wilberforce's friends that took part in the abolition of slavery and the slave trade in the UK, and they were involved in so many different areas of debt relief and helping poorer people and promoting education and different things, but it was all across society. They changed so much, and yet their evangelical convictions about the need for salvation were there enmeshed right throughout them.
Yeah, beautiful example.
Great. And when you're engaging in issues like this, Felicia, when you're perhaps interacting with or working with someone who's got a very different worldview from you, do you have any practical pointers as to how you can retain your Christian saltiness and work with somebody, be co-belligerent with them without just saying you're wrong and you've got a very different view, but actually to bring that in and to maybe challenge them to think about a different view of humanity or justice?
Yes, thank you for that. I mean, when you're talking about co-belligerence, of course, there are always good things in common that we can work on. So building the relationship on things that you do have in common, which is obviously that things aren't right out there, that the world is broken, that there are things that need addressing, and that there are injustices. And then seeing, well, that actually it's not just, so for instance, if we're talking from just because at least I can talk about from a sexism, racism point of view, then it's not that every white man out there, therefore, is the oppressor and is wrong. And it's just kind of helping people to see that actually we see the person in front of us, and it's not, we don't define that person by the group that they're in, and therefore that they're just all bad or all good. As you were saying, it doesn't work like that. So I think just coming alongside people with recognizing where they're at, hearing their story as well is important, of course, because they will have been hurt by many things, and being able to show love and graciousness in the way we gently show actually that we're all flawed and we all have things that need addressing. That's just a little bit, Mark, but would that kind of answer some of it?
And I think it does very much. And I think you're absolutely right that some of the most vociferous activists who can seem the angriest and the most difficult to reach personally, they've often got a very personal story of some hurt. And sometimes if we can help to get alongside them in some ways, that can really change the dynamics, can't it?
Yes, you'll have lots of from that, Mark. So yes, thank you for that. Yeah,
there's always the question behind the question, isn't there, and the person behind the issue. So we've got another question here from Moise Nsengiyumba, and just to summarize that, Moise is asking, how can we place particular emphasis on social status instead of the patient's condition? And I guess that interaction or that intersection between somebody's socioeconomic status and the particular condition that's there, you'll have seen that as an inner city GP butting up against each other all the time. So how might you address that in those situations?
So of course we have to, I suppose it's that seeing the person as a whole. So let's say when you do address the medical concerns that they've come with, but you're also seeing, so someone who's from a different social status but coming with the same medical problems will have other things. We all know as doctors and dentists and healthcare professionals that that the clinical picture is wider than just the symptoms that someone's presenting with. So in other words, it's the whole of who's been asking them to come now, why are they coming now, the psychology behind these kind of things, sort of like what's their background, what are they particularly concerned about, those will know, we talk about ticket of gender, hidden agenda, ticket of entry. What are they really coming about? What's the thing behind the thing, as it were? And so when you're looking at, so you're not just tackling the social status, you're thinking about the medical problem in front of you, the person in front of you with their medical problem, but also actually, is there something about their status that has led them to the situation that they're in now? Or maybe that actually there's other anxieties that they're not really saying, or they didn't themselves know was contributing to it. Mark, do you want to come in there on anything at all?
No, I think that's really helpful. I think seeing the whole person is the real key there, isn't it? Like you've said, because our medical textbooks don't always help us there, do they? We'll focus on the condition, but maybe not see the context around that. And that's incredibly important, particularly in many situations of low socioeconomic status. So we've got a great question here from Marissa Risolta in the Philippines. And she says, thank you for your presentation. How can we comfort or counsel the victims and family members when justice was not served justly to them?
Well, yes, and we see that everywhere, don't we? Well, again, if you look at sometimes the worldly response or your other colleagues who don't know the Lord, the response can be different. It can be, well, that's just the way things are. Or so again, it's a whole person thing. So we can see them, have compassion, empathize with them in a way that's within right professional boundaries, and then see whether actually there is any recourse, or point them to either other organizations or people who can help, whether they might need counseling or extra support in other ways, rather than just thinking, actually, that's my job done. It's got nothing to do with me now. So yeah, that's kind of my first thoughts on that.
Yes, absolutely. And I think as Christians, that can sometimes be a time to weave in some of our faith in an appropriate way, can't it? To maybe speak about the God of justice, obviously dependent on the situation, that could be very delicate, but to remind or to help people see that, bad things will happen to us here, and yet there is a wider picture. There is a God of justice who has come into human history to address that injustice and to put things right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Now we've got a comment really, and then a question from Arna Biswas, who is working in a tribal area in Jharkhand, I think, in the eastern India. And Arnab says that many of their patients are mostly farmers. They don't have liquid cash, but they do have assets like animal husbandry and produce from the farms. So they've made a provision to have clinics in the evening after people come back from the fields. That's very good about clinic times. I don't know if you allow for people returning from the fields in your inner city London
I haven't come across that many.
No, but that sounds excellent for what Arnab's doing there. And they're planning to use a barter system for a consultation fee instead of paying by money. So paying with produce instead, which is just a small way to help them feel included in the health system. So I think that's an excellent example of justice in practice, isn't it? Then Arnab's got another question here. How can we continue to practice biblical justice if our colleagues, administrators, and seniors are not in favor of it because they feel it's bad for the healthcare as a business? After all, we do need money to survive. And it's assumed that biblical justice in healthcare is really free access to healthcare, but it's not sustainable. So how do we address the economic situations and the business side of healthcare?
And that's so very real. So thank you for that question. It is a very real and right question, isn't it? It's not like we don't have those resources to just give everything away free. I think it's partly thinking about when you're designing your systems and thinking actually what bit we still need to survive as a business. We still have to have money for the resources, etc. And that's right. And that's biblical as well. But it's kind of like, well, are there particular groups that we can, that we might be able to make concessions for, or we might be able to, provide a free resource now that we're we're able to kind of break even in these other parts. So it's thinking about how you design your system and your policies to be able to kind of allow, maybe, if I don't know if this is even the right way, but, kind of allow gleaning in the fields, in Ruth, where there was, rather than just take everything, it's like saying, okay, well, maybe if we need to charge a bit more for people who can afford to, so that we can actually maybe allow for those who can't afford it to be able to access something. But yeah, Ruth is a beautiful story of justice, isn't it, really, actually?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm aware of many stories where mission hospitals have done similar things, that those that can pay privately are able to pay for certain services and access them, and then some of the profits from that is fed into systems for those who can't pay. And many systems where just helping people to pay a little bit, or perhaps help them with um, some of the needs that their more general needs, can help to do that. So it might even be putting like a health insurance system in place so that people can pay a small amount regularly, and then there's funds available to that. I guess it's perhaps more difficult depending on how financially orientated our employers are, and that may be more difficult in some situations. But it sounds like we can usually make a difference in some way.
Mm.
We've got some good interactions there between David and Arnab on the Q&A. Does it mean free access or universal access, with each person paying as they are able? Yes, that's often the difference between equality and equity, isn't it? That it doesn't mean everyone has to do the same, but it's about usually equity of access or opportunity for them.
And I was just going to say with that as well, because in answer to that first question that we just answered, it's also remembering that actually, even though it can be hard with your colleagues who don't think the same way, because obviously they won't necessarily, but actually it is right for us as Christians to stand up and advocate in whatever way we can for those who can't. Even if that does mean a sacrifice or cost to ourselves to some extent, we have to be wise about when and how we do it, but to kind of not, because you're worried about sort of maybe the fallback on yourself, etc. Is something that we need to bear in mind, that it doesn't mean that when things are hard, but it's also that by doing something for someone else, you'd be amazed. I mean, I bet there are many stories all around of how that actually changes other people's hearts and honors God and shows something more and gives, and bears fruit for the gospel in ways that we wouldn't know. So step out in faith and ask God to show you what you can do in those situations.
Lisa, absolutely. And it's that stepping out and making a start, isn't it? We may not be able to change everything in the world. Well, of course we can't, but we can certainly use the opportunities God has given us. And there's that phrase that we talked about yesterday, Felicia, about doing what only you can do.
Yes.
That we love, and that God will often give you a mixture of skills and opportunities and interests, and there may be something quite specific, maybe quite small, or much bigger, or an opportunity that you weren't looking for and just came along, that you can make a difference with. So often that first step is just thinking about it. That one of the other advocacy resources that we could put in the resources to send around is a CMF booklet called The Advocacy Journey, which just helps people think practically about what are some of the areas that we might be able to work in, or to start in as well. I think there are some very complicated situations. For instance, thinking about justice in a conflict zone, or other situations like that. So when we think about some of the really complex questions at the moment, say Gaza or Ukraine, there are many people, quite rightly, who want to see justice in these situations, and yet very often it can be difficult to see through the media coverage, or through some of the different challenges around the underlying causes, to think, well, what is the right way to do justice in this area? And sometimes we can be paralyzed by thinking, well, it's all too complicated, I can't do anything. But do you have any advice for people who do feel that paralysis of it's all just too complicated?
Well, I can definitely identify with that. We can become so overwhelmed that we don't even know where to start, so we don't start anywhere. Well, like I was saying before, first and foremost, pray. The fact that God has put that on your heart to think, actually, I want to do something, but I don't know what to do. Just say, Lord, I don't know what to do and I feel overwhelmed, but please show me where I can at least do something. And it might be something as simple as getting a few people to pray about that situation, getting your church to pray, and then maybe even have now that we have, so many good online tools, maybe having a nationwide or some or hospital wide or whatever wide, prayer meeting or some other forum to just highlight some things. It's amazing what you can do that you hadn't realized. Get a prayer network started, etc. And then, yes, you're absolutely right, though, Mark. The thing is, it can be hard to pick through just the narrative about everything. And it's good to remember that it's not all just bad or all just good. There's a mixture of both in these situations. So I think to be open-minded and to not just kind of jump on one bandwagon about everything just being bad or good, and just to think, okay, how should I be, what's my heart attitude and my mindset about this that the Lord is showing me from his word. And then it could be that opportunities will arise as you ask for them, that you can do something. I think you've probably got some other examples, Mark, that you could probably talk into that.
Well, I mean, almost certainly. And I think praying, learning, reading, discussing, and taking time to reflect on scripture often helps things to become clearer, doesn't it? I mean, my wife Rachel and I, we've been involved in offender healthcare and prison healthcare for many years. And that's been something where we got involved in gradually because God gave opportunities. And to begin with, we didn't know much about it. And then lots more opportunities have come around, and you gain in wisdom and think, what are the real issues, that places where we can make a difference? And they've made yes, it's often a long journey, isn't it? Is it Eugene Peterson who talks about a long obedience in the same direction? That it's not about just liking something on Twitter or signing a petition. It's often thinking, okay, what are the things that I can, over a period of months and perhaps years, that I can continue to plug away at and work with others on? Again, I was thinking about Wilberforce and the anti-slavery movement in the 17 and 1800s, and how it took decades to see that come across. There were so many disappointments and setbacks, and yet they kept going with that, and that's incredibly important.
Yes.
So a couple more questions in the Q&A. So George Chu has put some very helpful comments in there. The pressing issues in social justice concern gender pay, racial injustice, housing overconsumption by a minority, and climate changes and energy usage. And I think that's absolutely right, George. There's so many things that affect individuals that are down to societies, nations, lifestyles, and they're very difficult for us to make a difference on, but we can often start on those. And so learning about what are the big issues, even when they're not simple, is a good thing to do. And then another question here from Krikituli Rutsa, who asks, how do medical ethics and laws balance a doctor's rights with a patient's right to receive treatment? So I guess that's a conscience question, isn't it? About how do we as Christians approach situations when what the patient is able to get and what we would like to give or feel able to give, how does that conflict in a justice manner?
I was going to say you are the king of conscientious objection, Mark, because you talk on it all the time. You obviously need to be aware of what the guidance is for your country in terms of you as a medical or dental practitioner, and therefore, and it doesn't mean that we can't say things, but it's how you do that as well. But again, I suppose it comes back to sort of also seeing the patient in front of you and what it is about them that's particularly wanting to push a certain agenda. I mean, that's one thing that comes to mind for me. But Mark, talk about the conscientious objection piece for you.
Well, I think these things can often bash up against each other, can't they? But I think seeing both the healthcare worker and the patient as somebody made in God's image, it can then give us a much more mature conversation than just about, this is my right, etc., etc. Both are important in looking at that. And, when we think about complicated issues such as gender medicine, that's a massive issue in the West, people will often come saying, this is my right. Actually, it may not even be best for them. It may not be good for them. And that can be something where we can have actually quite tricky conversations, but they can be very fruitful if we start to unpack things a little bit more and say, what's going on behind this request? and how, as a Christian healthcare worker, can we bring some salt and light into a situation that maybe otherwise, it may be quite complicated.
Well,
But yeah, that's very helpful. Now, Felicia, we're just about out of time now. Is there anything else that you'd like to say as we close? Maybe one final question from me, I guess, is how we've talked about that balance between social justice and evangelism and sharing faith. Are there any pointers you give people on how they can weave those two things together and move on from just doing justice issues into weaving their faith into that as well?
Yes, of course, we've got some really good tools for that kind of thing. So let's say the Saline course, in terms of thinking, how do you bring faith into the conversation? So a lot of people, whether in your countries and certainly in the UK, think that you actually can't bring faith into the conversation. But if people can see that you are someone of compassion, you care for them, you do care about justice, and you do see them as a whole person, it gives you even more sort of right and voice and presence to be able to ask some of those questions like, do you have a faith that helps you at a time like this? Or even to share something of yourself. I mean, I've certainly found that when I've been able to say something, well, I'll pray for you. That's been gratefully received. So there are ways that we can certainly be salt and light in our manner, what we say and what we do.
Excellent. What a great answer. Thank you. And yes, the Saline process, which I know ICMDA and our partner organizations love to promote and teach. So we'll include something about that in the show notes. And Felicia, you're also writing, or you've just written a small CMF leaflet booklet called the CMF File on Justice in Healthcare. That's about to come out and be published by CMF very shortly. So we'll try and include the notes on where people will be able to find that when that's available in the coming weeks. Well, it just remains for me to thank all of you for coming and taking part and joining us on this webinar today, and to thank you very much, Felicia, for helping us to seek God's heart for justice in our healthcare environments. And so may the Lord give you all wisdom, peace, and courage to serve him and to seek his justice in whatever situation you find yourself before we see you again. And please let your colleagues know about ICMDA webinars. So thank you and goodbye.